Welcome to episode 13 of Channel Legendarium. We're going to take a step away from our usual wheelhouse of legend and mythology and focus on a historical event that has nonetheless become part of our modern mythology, the Christmas Truce of World War I, a time when soldiers said no to war and came together in a celebration of their shared humanity at a time when men were dying by the tens of thousands. When the poorly named War to End All Wars broke out in the summer of 1914, both the Germans and the Austrians and the Russians, French, and British assumed that it would be over in a matter of months, if not weeks. In fact, German society ladies were so confident that their menfolk would be home before Christmas that they even gave them lists of clothes and shoes they wanted them to loot from boutiques in Paris for them. However, as the war continued, officers on both sides began to learn certain lessons, like, for example, that massed frontal charges into machine gun fire is not a great idea. And with nowhere else to go but down, the soldiers began to dig trenches. The trenches in the early days of the war were especially awful places to live, as nobody knew how to build them properly. They were prone to collapsing, they weren't deep enough at times, and in a pinch, they doubled as bathrooms. In between the German and Franco-British trenches was an especially desolate area called No Man's Land. No Man's Land was the space between the trenches, so raked by machine gun fire and cannons that it was said not even a blade of grass would grow there. How could anything good come out of such an awful place? Well, it did. On Christmas Eve 1914, men with the Royal Irish Regiment began reporting that the Germans were singing Christmas carols in their trenches, not much more than 300 feet away in their own trenches. Some of the German soldiers even began to call out, English soldier, a Merry Christmas." The two sides began to sing Christmas carols to one another, with the Germans singing Silent Night and the British singing the First Noel. Fairly soon, the German soldiers began calling, English soldier, come out here to us," in broken English. It's worth noting that many German soldiers knew at least some English, as plenty of them had worked in the United Kingdom, oftentimes as waiters or in food service. The officers, needless to say, were a little worried about this. They feared that if the men came together in a celebration of their shared humanity and the universal brotherhood of men, well, they might be less likely to slaughter their fellow men in the numbers that the war demanded. Nonetheless, the soldiers began coming out in great numbers, meeting and shaking hands, and exchanging gifts of cigarettes and plum puddings, often the only things they had to exchange. It's worth noting that the Christmas truce was technically illegal. The men had no authority to go out into no man's land and fraternize with the enemy, but the officers could only fume while the soldiers came together in a Christmas celebration. The Christmas truce spread across 2/3 of the front across southern France. Most likely it happened between British soldiers with German troops from Saxony state, a state in the German Empire where anti-war sentiment was strong. One Saxony trooper was reported as saying, "We are Saxons, you are Anglo-Saxons, so why are we fighting?" Games of soccer began to break out. There was one game between the 133rd Royal Saxon Regiment versus the Scottish Highlanders, who wore kilts. Much to the amazement of the Germans, the kilts sometimes blew up in the wind. While the Royal Saxon Regiment won in a 3-2 victory, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders were able to beat the Germans 4-1. One British soldier named Clifton Stockwell met a German soldier who spent much time in London, and the two shared reminiscences of the great city together. However, the officers were worried that it would erode fighting spirit, and indeed they were relieved when sniping began to resume after the men returned to their trenches during Christmas night so they could get back to the business of slaughtering their fellow men. However, Captain Clifton Stockwell was not so willing to just let go of the Christmas truce. In a final act of defiance against the war itself, he raised a flag which said Merry Christmas over the British trenches and fired 3 shots in salute to the German soldiers. His counterpart, Hauptmann von Sinner, responded with his own salute of gunfire. Much to the relief of the officers, no doubt, fighting resumed by the next day. However, in a few sectors, the truce held until New Year's 1915. Unfortunately, officers on the German, French, and British sides worked very hard to make sure that the Christmas truce never had another sequel. Whenever Christmas Eve came around, officers threatened men who promised a sequel to the Christmas truce with dire punishments, and some officers even organized offensives on Christmas Day for the sole purpose of making sure that English and German soldiers never broke bread again. However, the Christmas truce entered modern mythology as an example of the universal brotherhood of humankind during one of its most dismal days. And that wraps things up for this episode of Channel Legendarium. I want to wish you and yours a Merry Christmas. If you enjoyed what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. If you've got anything to say, I'd love to hear it in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I'll see you again in a couple of days.